I stood by the window of our spacious Manhattan loft, looking at the endless stream of cars and pedestrians. The sky was slowly covered with gray clouds, and for some reason, I liked it. The grayness reflected what I felt inside. Once, Oliver and I moved here, dreaming of a new, vibrant chapter in our lives. And now all I saw was monotony. Every morning I wake up, we have breakfast, we discuss who will pick up the car from the shop, how soon we need to update the insurance, the same things over and over. Oliver, my husband, was always stable, reliable. He's a successful lawyer, a man who knows exactly what he wants and exactly how to get it. That's what attracted me to him once. But over the years, our marriage had turned into a routine. Romance, passion, fire, they were all in the past. I realized we weren't talking about important things anymore, not sharing our dreams, not striving for something new. We were just existing together, like a well-coordinated team, each performing our role. Today at the office was as usual. I led another meeting, reports, deadlines. Everything was going according to plan. But something shifted when I saw him. Ryan. He was a new creative from another department, and for the first time I noticed how differently he fit into this office space. He wasn't like everyone else. There was a lightness to his movements, as if work for him was not a duty but a game. And I caught myself looking at him a little longer than I should have. He effortlessly joined our meeting, laughing and making remarks that went beyond the formalities. Something about his boldness, his freedom of thought attracted me. And at that moment, I suddenly realized how much I missed that. Not Ryan, but the feeling that life could still be more than just routine. When the meeting ended, I returned to my desk, but thoughts of him didn't leave me. I couldn't quite understand what had stirred these feelings in me. I loved Oliver. I loved our life, our home. But when I closed my eyes, the image of Ryan stood before me, with his easy smile and confidence. And then I realized I felt empty, a huge emptiness that couldn't be filled with work or the life I had known. That day at the office had drained me completely. I stayed late, trying to finish a project that seemed like it would never end. When I finally stepped outside, the sharp autumn wind hit me, stealing the last bit of energy I had left. All I wanted was to relax. The bar around the corner was the perfect place I sometimes went to after long days to get away from work and everyday life. I walked inside, instantly enveloped by the familiar dim lighting and the sound of soft music playing in the background. There weren't many people, a couple at the bar, a few at the far tables. I took a seat by the window and ordered a glass of wine. Sitting alone, I reflected on how strange my life had become. On the surface, I had everything. A stable job, a marriage with a successful man, a beautiful apartment. But something inside me was aching, like something essential was missing. I didn't even know what it was. As soon as I took my first sip of wine, I heard a familiar voice behind me. "Maggie?" I turned around and saw Ryan. His easy smile, slightly messy hair, and casual style stood out so sharply from the strictness of my usual surroundings. He approached me with a carefree attitude, as if this were just an ordinary meeting between colleagues. "I didn't expect to see you here," he said, sliding into the seat across from me. I smiled, feeling an unfamiliar sense of freedom in his presence. "Well, after a day like this, I needed to unwind," I replied, trying to hide my slight nervousness. Ryan ordered a beer, and we started with the usual work topics: projects, deadlines, corporate meetings. But soon enough, our conversation shifted to more personal matters. We talked about life in New York, about how hard it is sometimes to balance work and personal life. I realized that for the first time in a long time, I felt at ease, without the heaviness that always accompanied my conversations with Oliver. Here, with Ryan, I didn't need to play the role of the perfect wife or the successful manager. I could just be myself. Sometimes I think we get so stuck in our everyday lives that we forget why we're even living, I admitted, slightly surprised by my own honesty. Ryan looked at me with understanding, and there was something in his eyes I hadn't seen in other men in a long time. Genuine interest, not pretense. "You're not the only one thinking that. I think a lot of us get trapped in routine. Sometimes you just need to stop and do something that really makes you feel alive." His words resonated so deeply within me that I froze for a moment. Ryan was right. and this conversation felt like a reminder of how long I had ignored my own desires and needs. The longer we talked, the more I felt drawn to him. It was a frightening and thrilling feeling all at once. When I looked at the clock, it was already late. We had spent the entire evening engrossed in conversation, as if time had lost its meaning. I didn't want to leave, but I knew it was time. Ryan walked me to the exit, and at that moment I realized that I had developed something more than just a fondness for him. It was something deeper, and for the first time in a long time, I felt alive. The next few weeks were marked by more frequent, though seemingly accidental, encounters with Ryan. We crossed paths in the office, during meetings, in hallways, in the elevator. One time I went out for coffee at the nearby cafe, and there he was again. At first, I thought it was just coincidence, but the more it happened, the clearer it became that he was also seeking these moments. Our conversations always started with work, discussing projects, deadlines, and how things were progressing. But soon, they shifted to more personal topics. Ryan talked about his ambitions, how he dreamed of leaving the office grind to start something of his own. His honesty and openness were something new to me. I found myself looking forward to these conversations more than I should, but there was always an underlying tension. Every look from him carried more than just friendliness, and I felt it. I was drawn to him, and with every new encounter, it became clearer that this was more than just casual attraction. Instead of feeling excited, I felt anxious. These feelings were wrong. I was married, and despite the problems between Oliver and me, we had a shared past and a stable life. Ryan represented something new, unexpected, something I saw as a spark of passion, not a deep connection. When I returned home to Oliver, it felt like I could just forget my thoughts about Ryan and go back to my normal life. I kept telling myself that this was just a fleeting crush, an attraction fueled by the lack of passion in my marriage with Oliver. I began to think that what I felt for Ryan was just a result of the long-lost fire in my relationship with my husband. But that realization didn't make it any easier. I knew that what was happening wouldn't end well. Each time I saw Ryan, I fought this internal conflict. He seemed so light, so free, and I was drowning in guilt. There was too much at stake, and I realized that these meetings with him were only making things worse. This was infatuation, a burst of passion that had suddenly come into my life, but it couldn't last forever. Weeks of fleeting glances and flirtatious tension had passed. I had tried to keep my distance, but it was harder than I expected. Ryan grew closer with each encounter, his presence filling the air with a strange, charged electricity. When he finally suggested we meet for dinner to discuss a new project, I knew it wasn't just a business meeting. Inside me, something stirred, a mixture of fear and anticipation, but I agreed anyway. We chose a small restaurant in the heart of the city. It was cozy, with dim lighting and soft music creating an intimate atmosphere. My heartbeat quickened the moment we sat down. Ryan seemed calm, but his eyes were focused on me, making me feel both tense and drawn in at the same time. The conversation started with work, discussing the project, new ideas, plans, but it quickly shifted to more personal topics. "Have you ever thought about what might have happened if you'd taken a different path in life?" Ryan asked suddenly, catching me off guard. I smirked, trying to hide the sudden wave of unease. "Sometimes," I said, looking at him, "but I guess we all make the choices that seem right at the time, and then we just live with the consequences." Ryan looked at me carefully as if trying to read my thoughts. There was something unusual about this moment. It felt like an invisible thread hung between us, connecting our hidden thoughts and desires. "There's always room for change," he said, and there was more in his words than just a casual conversation. My world seemed to shake. I knew exactly what lay beneath those words. It wasn't just talk about life. It was an invitation, subtle but clear. My heart clenched at the realization of what was really happening. As dinner came to an end, we stepped outside. The night was cool, the streets nearly empty. We stood there and the silence between us was filled with growing tension. I couldn't bring myself to leave first. Ryan took a step closer, his hand brushing mine. "Maggie," he said softly but firmly, "we both know what's going on." My mind filled with thoughts of how this was all a mistake, but in that moment, all those thoughts evaporated as he leaned in and kissed me. The kiss was brief, but it was filled with a passion I hadn't felt in a long time. It was a moment we had been avoiding for weeks, but it now felt inevitable. My mind tried to resist, but my body responded differently. When we pulled away, I knew a line had been crossed. Everything had changed in that instant, and there was no going back. I stood there, at a crossroads, unsure of what lay ahead, but certain that returning to my old life would be far more complicated than I had imagined. When I returned home after the dinner with Ryan, everything seemed the same, but something inside me had changed. Oliver was sitting at his computer, immersed in work as usual. He looked up when I walked in, gave me a brief smile, and returned to his tasks. It was familiar, it was expected, but inside, I was different. I tried to live as I always had, planning our future, discussing household matters, going to work, and coming home. But with each passing day, it became harder. After that kiss with Ryan, I felt as if I was no longer the same person. Every accidental glance, every encounter in the office, whether it was a fleeting look, his presence in the hallway, or at a meeting, made my heart race. I tried not to show it, but inside there was a storm brewing. I often thought about that evening, how easily it all happened, how naturally we crossed the line we had been avoiding for so long. I tried to convince myself it was a mistake, that I could return to the way things were as if nothing had happened. But every time I saw Ryan, I realized that wasn't possible. We both knew something had changed between us. Oliver didn't seem to notice the changes in me, or at least, he acted as if everything was normal. He was absorbed in his own routine, in the familiar structure of our life, and that only deepened my sense of guilt. I tried to tell myself that I should be grateful for what I had, stability, reliability, predictability, but at the same time, I couldn't escape the feeling that I could no longer pretend that this was enough for me. I started noticing little things that I hadn't before, how rarely Oliver and I truly talked, how we lived in the same space, yet seemed to be in different worlds. Ryan, with his spontaneity and freedom, seemed like the complete opposite of this life. I kept sinking deeper into thoughts about what drew me to him. It wasn't love, not that deep connection that binds people for a lifetime. It was passion, desire, something uncontrollable that had flared between us. Each time I came home after seeing Ryan at the office, I felt more lost. My mind told me that I had to stop, that this needed to end before it got worse. But my heart, my body, everything inside me was pulling in the opposite direction. I tried to convince myself that I could get back on track, that this rush of emotions would pass, but every new day proved me wrong. Oliver had started noticing that something was different about me. It could no longer go unnoticed. I had become more distant, lost in thought, often preoccupied with my own worries. He began asking questions, trying to understand what was going on, but I always gave vague responses. Work's been busy. I'm just tired. Those explanations didn't seem to satisfy him, but for a while he stopped pressing. Meanwhile, at work, they announced a corporate party. It was a chance for everyone to relax after a stressful project, and my colleagues insisted I attend. Even Oliver encouraged me. Go, it'll be good for you to unwind. The evening started off harmlessly. Music, cocktails, light snacks. I tried to keep my distance from Ryan, avoiding eye contact, but after a couple of cocktails, my resolve began to weaken. When he approached me with a smile and suggested we continue the evening at his place, the rational me would have refused. But in that moment, I wasn't thinking about the consequences. Everything that had been holding me back seemed distant and unimportant, and I agreed. We stepped out of the restaurant, and the cool night air made me pause for a second, but I kept walking with him. His apartment was nearby, and we talked about trivial things as we walked, until we arrived at his place. It all felt so natural, though deep down I knew I was treading on dangerous ground. When we were alone, the tension that had been building for weeks became undeniable. He moved closer, and I allowed myself to be swept up in the moment. We began kissing, releasing the energy that had been bottled up for so long. It all happened quickly, but at some point, reality began to creep back in. My phone rang. It was Oliver. I saw his name on the screen, but I didn't answer. At that moment, I just turned off the phone, deciding I'd deal with it later. The night passed in a strange mix of tension and internal conflict. We didn't cross the line, but my feelings were conflicted. In the morning, I woke up with a heavy head and the realization that I was playing with fire. My head was pounding, and guilt came in waves. I quickly showered, dressed, and left without saying much to Ryan. On the way home, I came up with a plan. Oliver would undoubtedly ask questions, and I needed a convincing story. I called my friend from work and asked her to cover for me if Oliver asked where I'd been. It was the only thought that calmed me. I knew that if Oliver found out the truth, everything would change. So I hoped he would believe my version of spending the night with a friend. But with every passing minute, the guilt grew stronger. I realized that I was risking everything I had, and how long I could continue balancing on the edge was only a matter of time. When I returned home after that night with Ryan, the sense of anxiety only grew stronger. Oliver was sitting on the couch watching TV, but his focus wasn't on the screen. When I walked in, he turned off the television and looked at me. "Where were you?" he asked, his tone calm but filled with tension, making my heart race even faster. I had expected this question, prepared for it all the way home, but my mind was still clouded by the events of the night, and I felt a wave of fear wash over me. "At Sarah's," I said, trying to sound as confident as possible. "We were talking about work, and I just fell asleep there." Oliver stared at me as if he were trying to read something on my face that I didn't want him to see. I avoided his gaze, heading toward the bedroom to change, hoping to hide my unease. "Why didn't you answer my calls?" he continued, not letting it go. That question threw me off balance. I quickly thought of a plausible response. "My phone was on silent, and then I must have turned it off by mistake when I went to bed," I replied, trying to sound as relaxed as possible. Oliver said nothing, but his silence was louder than words. I could feel that he suspected something, that his thoughts were already wandering in a dangerous direction. His silence hung over me as I got ready in the shower, trying to compose myself. The next day at the office, Ryan greeted me with the same easy smile, as if nothing had happened between us. He acted confidently, as if he knew I'd come back to him again. But this time I was more cautious, avoiding his direct looks and conversations whenever I could. A few days passed in this tension until one evening after work, Ryan approached me with an unexpected proposal. He suggested we spend the weekend together at a scenic hotel out of town. "For creative work," he added with a slight smile. But I knew it wasn't just about work. It was something more, an excuse. The confidence in his words and in his eyes made it clear that he no longer saw our connection as something fleeting. I stood there unsure of what to say. On the one hand, I knew I had to stop. This was becoming too dangerous. But at the same time, I felt drawn to him, to the forbidden and the unknown. I realized that if I agreed, it would be a step from which there was no return. "I'll think about it," I replied, trying to delay the moment of decision. Ryan didn't push. He just smiled, looked into my eyes, and walked away, leaving me alone with my thoughts. Everything inside me was conflicted, my mind and heart, fear and desire. I knew I was playing with fire, but the thought of going on this trip with him was too tempting. When I got home, I sat in silence for a long time, contemplating just how far I was willing to go. Oliver was once again immersed in his work, and I realized that he sensed the changes in me, but wasn't yet ready to ask the real question. My life had become a complicated web of lies and doubts, and I no longer knew how to untangle it. The next morning, I made my decision. I agreed to go on the trip with Ryan, even though deep down, I knew it was a step that would change everything. When Ryan's proposal became a reality, I had to come up with an explanation for Oliver. Telling him the truth was impossible, and I knew that if I hesitated, suspicion would inevitably arise. That evening, when I returned home, I gathered all my calm and approached him as he sat at the table, immersed in work. "Oliver, I need to tell you something," I began, trying to keep my voice steady. "This weekend I'm going on a short trip, organized by the company. It's for a creative project, kind of like a team-building event out of town." He looked at me, slightly furrowing his brow, clearly surprised. "Is this something new?" he asked. "In all the years you've worked there, you've never mentioned trips like this." My heart raced, but I tried not to let it show. Yes, it's new. They want to support new ideas and give departments a chance to work in a different environment. To inspire us, I replied, trying to sound as casual as possible. Oliver nodded, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. He had never been particularly suspicious, and I relied on the fact that his trust in me would remain intact. However, I noticed that he seemed a little disappointed. "I just thought we could spend some time together this weekend," he said softly. "It's been a while since we've done anything together." His words hit me harder than I expected. Oliver rarely spoke openly about our relationship, and his desire to spend time together was a painful reminder that I was betraying his trust. "I know," I replied quietly, trying to hide my guilt. "But I'll be back on Sunday and we can do something then." He nodded, though clearly disappointed. But he didn't ask any more questions. Oliver trusted me, and it was that trust I was betraying with my decision. When Ryan and I finally arrived at the boutique hotel, I felt a flutter of nervousness. The hotel, nestled deep in the mountains and surrounded by a dense forest, seemed cut off from reality, far from everything that tied me to my everyday life. It felt like the perfect place to escape, if only for a while, from all the guilt that had been weighing on me. We got out of the car, and the soft breeze filled with the scent of pine and earth touched my skin. Ryan looked at me with that same confident gaze, and I realized that this time there would be no more evasions. We both knew why we were here, and the air was thick with that unspoken understanding. Dinner began on an open terrace under a starry sky. The evening was warm, with a gentle breeze caressing our faces. The sounds of the forest created a feeling of complete seclusion, as if the world outside no longer existed. We sat, drank wine, talked, and laughed. But with each passing moment, I could feel the tension between us building. Ryan was as relaxed as ever. He talked about his plans, his dreams, and I felt myself being drawn back into his world, a world where there were no restrictions. I listened, but my thoughts kept returning to what was about to happen. Every gesture, every look from him only intensified that anticipation. After dinner, we stayed on the terrace, enjoying the last rays of the setting sun. I felt truly free, as if the boundaries of my real life were beginning to blur. I tried not to think about what awaited me back home, not to think about how I would return to Oliver with these new memories. As night fell, the stars shone brightly in the dark sky. We returned to our room, where the soft light of candles and warm tones of the decor created a cozy atmosphere. I knew I was approaching a moment that would change everything. Ryan stepped closer to me. Our eyes met, and I realized I could no longer resist. That night was a turning point. Everything we had held back over the past months came rushing out. In his touch, I felt both tenderness and strength, while my own emotions swirled into something indescribable. It was a moment when I allowed myself to fully give in to my desires, without thinking about the consequences. When morning came, I felt different. My life could no longer return to the way it was, and though I didn't know what would happen next, I understood one thing. This night had changed me. When I returned to the city after that night in the hotel, the world around me seemed the same, but I knew I had changed. The city, its noise, its rhythm, they all felt familiar and yet distant. My heart was heavy with thoughts that wouldn't leave me alone. I realized that I could no longer hide what was happening between Ryan and me. What once seemed like an innocent secret now carried real consequences that I couldn't ignore. Oliver greeted me with a smile when I got home. He was genuinely happy to see me, and he suggested we finally spend the weekend together, just as he had been hoping for. His initiative felt like a knife cutting through my conscience. I sat beside him, but I felt like a stranger. His desire to spend time with me, his love, something he so rarely expressed, suddenly became a weight I could hardly bear. I realized that with every glance, every hidden feeling for another man, I was betraying him. He suggested we go to the park for a picnic, to remember the old days when we first started dating. I looked at him, and for a moment, I wanted to go back to those simpler times. But things were different now. I couldn't just return to the life we had before. Guilt and anxiety twisted inside me, and I didn't know how to break free from it. Ryan hadn't left my thoughts even as I tried to focus on Oliver. I kept replaying that night in my mind. It wasn't just passion, it was a feeling that had turned my world upside down. Every encounter with Ryan, every look or brief message only deepened the tension between us. He looked at me as if he knew I wouldn't be able to step away even if I wanted to. And deep down, I knew he was right. Each day, the guilt grew, as did the realization that this couldn't go on much longer. Oliver began asking more questions, his attention to my absence and changed behavior becoming more insistent. He sensed that I was pulling away, though he didn't yet know why. I could see his pain, but I couldn't change anything. My heart was torn between two worlds, the stability and reliability with Oliver, and the uncontrollable passion with Ryan. I knew that one day the truth would come out, and when that happened, I would have to make the choice I had been avoiding all this time. More and more, I realized that my relationship with Ryan couldn't remain a secret forever. But the passion I felt for him was so strong that giving it up seemed impossible. I knew I was risking everything I had, but every time I thought about ending things with Ryan, I felt an overwhelming sense of loss that I couldn't handle. Oliver was trying to bring us back to the life we had before, but I felt that it was becoming more and more impossible. His attempts to reconnect as a couple only intensified my guilt and reminded me how far I had strayed. Yet at the same time, every time I closed my eyes, I remembered Ryan's touch, his confidence, and realized again that I couldn't just walk away from it. More and more, I understood that soon I would have to make a choice. And everything depended on that choice. My life, my marriage, my future. But while that decision still loomed, I continued to walk the edge, sinking deeper into this forbidden world from which I saw no way out. Over time, Oliver's suspicions began to grow. He didn't speak about it openly, but I could sense something had shifted in his behavior. Every time I was late from work, every vague explanation I gave, every glance at my phone when I checked messages from Ryan began to feel like it was under scrutiny. I tried to stay calm, to act like everything was normal, but inside the anxiety grew. Oliver started asking more questions, and they were too specific, though he tried to hide his curiosity. He asked how my projects were going at work, why I was staying later than usual, and whether I was overworked. His tone was calm, but I could feel the underlying doubt in every question, and every time he asked something, I found it harder to come up with believable answers. I began to worry. The secret I had been hiding for so long seemed fragile. Any word, any action could be the detail that revealed everything. Every time I left the house, every time I stayed late at work or met Ryan, I felt the tension building. It felt like the air had grown heavier, as if the atmosphere in the house itself was hinting that something was wrong. One evening, when I came home later than usual, Oliver was sitting at the table with my phone in his hand. My heart raced, but I tried to remain calm. "You left it in the kitchen," he said, handing me the phone. His expression wasn't accusatory, but there was a subtle unease in his eyes. "Thanks," I quickly replied, trying not to reveal my inner panic. From that moment on, I noticed that he started paying more attention to me. He stayed home more often, went to the office less, almost as if he were watching me. I didn't know that he had already started investigating, although I suspected that his questions and observations weren't just casual curiosity. At work, my meetings with Ryan continued, but each one was laced with the fear that it would be the last before the truth came out. I tried to stay in control, but Ryan could sense my nerves. He suggested we be more careful, take fewer risks, but we both knew it was impossible to stop. Meanwhile, Oliver began noticing the small things I used to be able to hide. I didn't know he was studying my habits, tracking my actions. He started paying attention to the frequent messages, to how often I left the house alone. It seemed he was trying to piece together a puzzle that would uncover my lies. I continued to act like nothing was wrong, but inside, the fear that the truth would soon surface grew stronger. My world was beginning to fall apart, but I couldn't stop. I didn't know how much longer I could keep everything under control. Every time Oliver asked another question, I felt like the ground was slipping from under my feet. I feared that he already knew more than he was letting on and was preparing for the moment of confrontation. This fear made me anxious, leading me to make decisions that might only hasten the collapse of our life. What I didn't know was that Oliver had already begun collecting evidence. He was checking my messages, tracking my movements. While I thought I still had everything under control, he was piecing together the picture that would eventually lead to my exposure. I felt like I still held the threads in my hands, but in reality, they were unraveling more and more. And soon I would realize that there was no escaping the truth I had been dreading. That day, I came home later than usual. The office had been filled with back-to-back meetings, and my mind was consumed with trying to hide my anxiety from Oliver. I tried not to think about what awaited me at home, though deep inside, I knew something was wrong. When I walked into the apartment, the tension in the air was palpable. Oliver sat on the couch, holding my phone in his hands. He didn't get up to greet me, didn't smile like he usually did. There was something new in his gaze, something cold, something decisive. "Maggie," he started slowly, as if weighing every word. "We need to talk." Those words made my heart stop. I already knew this conversation would be different, that behind it was more than just his usual concern. Oliver's gaze was too heavy, and there was too much unspoken in his eyes. "What's going on?" I asked, trying to stay calm, but inside, panic was building. Oliver stared at me for a long moment, then tossed the phone onto the table in front of him. The screen was lit, and there I saw the messages from Ryan, the ones I had forgotten to delete. I couldn't hide the shock that flashed across my face. In that instant, I realized that all my efforts to hide the truth had come crashing down. "You lied to me." His voice was calm, but in that quietness there was something far more destructive than if he had yelled. "You said you were on a company trip, but you were at a hotel with Ryan." Everything inside me went cold. I wanted to say something to come up with an excuse, but every word I thought of felt pathetic and pointless. Oliver continued speaking, and every word was like a blow. "You thought I wouldn't notice?" His voice trembled as if he still couldn't believe what was happening. "I trusted you, and you—" He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence he already knew the end to. He pulled out a few photos from his pocket, printed from his email. They were pictures from the weekend I had spent with Ryan at the hotel. There was nothing more to hide. Everything was too obvious now. He had put all the pieces together and the picture was clear. "How long has this been going on?" he asked, his voice filled with pain. "How long have you been lying to me?" My heart pounded. I tried to pull myself together, but I knew there was no point in denying it any longer. The truth was staring him in the face, and all I could do was admit it. But I couldn't tell him everything. I couldn't tell him that the passion I felt for Ryan had consumed me entirely. I didn't want to hurt him more than I already had. "Oliver," I began quietly, I don't know how it happened. It started with work, and then— I didn't mean to lie to you." He didn't let me finish. "But you did," he interrupted. "You betrayed me, Maggie. How could you?" Tears welled up in my eyes, but I tried to hold them back. I had to tell him the truth, at least part of it. "Oliver, I can't pretend anymore. I lost the feelings we once had. I don't know when it happened, but I just don't think I can be with you the way I used to." My words hung in the air. It was like a devastating blow, and I saw him take a deep breath, as if those words had knocked the wind out of him. I didn't tell him about Ryan, didn't mention the passion that had swept me away. It wouldn't change anything. I didn't want to break his heart any more than I already had. Oliver was silent for a long time. He turned away from me as if he couldn't bear to look at me anymore. I could see his shoulders trembling, could see him struggling with the emotions that were overwhelming him. "I thought we could fix this," he said finally, almost in a whisper. "I thought we'd find a way, but now I don't know what to do." I stood in front of him, unable to offer him anything. My lies had destroyed our marriage, and I knew it. We both knew it. This conversation was the end, even if we hadn't said the words out loud. Oliver stood up, his eyes full of pain and disappointment, and he walked out, leaving me in silence, with the realization that I had destroyed everything. When Oliver left that night, leaving me in the empty apartment, I sat on the couch for a long time, unable to move. My life, once stable and predictable, had crumbled before my eyes. I knew there was no way back. Our conversation had been the point of no return. A few days had passed since then, and each one felt excruciatingly long. Oliver hadn't come back home. We didn't talk, didn't text each other. The silence between us was overwhelming. I could have waited for him to return, tried to salvage what was left of our marriage. But deep down, I knew it was futile. I had spent a lot of time reflecting on what had happened, and I realized that our marriage had been doomed for a long time. The affair wouldn't have happened if there hadn't already been a chasm between us. I had lost my feelings for Oliver long before I met Ryan, and it became clear only now, with the truth out in the open. Any attempt to restore what we had felt like a lie to myself. Oliver and I had become strangers to each other, and I could no longer live in the illusion of a family. I needed time to figure out myself, my feelings, and what I really wanted. The decision to leave Oliver didn't come easily, but I knew it was the only path that would allow me to move forward. I packed my things in silence, just a few suitcases, clothes, personal items, everything I needed to start a new life. I called my friend Sarah, with whom I had been close for years. I knew I could trust her. The moment she heard my voice full of confusion and exhaustion, she understood what had happened. "I can't do this anymore, Sarah," I admitted, sitting quietly in my bedroom. "I can't go back to him. I need time to figure out what to do next." "Of course you can stay with me as long as you need," she replied without asking any unnecessary questions. She had always been like that, understanding me without words, without needing explanations. I left that same evening. When I closed the door to the apartment Oliver and I had shared, I felt an overwhelming sense of emptiness. I knew this was the end of a chapter in my life, and though I didn't know what was coming next, I felt that I had made the right choice. Moving in with Sarah gave me the space to breathe. She supported me but didn't push. I could simply be myself, without needing to justify or explain my actions. I needed this time alone, to think about who I had become and what I truly wanted. My life with Oliver was over, and while there was immense pain in that, I began to understand that it was also a release. I was no longer bound by obligations, false promises, or a sense of duty. A new chapter lay ahead of me, and though I didn't yet know how it would unfold, I was ready to face it. The time I spent at Sarah's gave me the space to reflect on everything that had happened over the past few months. In the quiet and solitude, I began to realize that it wasn't just leaving Oliver that needed to happen. My future depended on whether I could break free from all the ties that had held me back in the past. Ryan, his presence in my life had been exciting, intense. He brought a passion that had long been missing, but the more time I spent thinking, the more I understood that passion was all we had. I had lost my marriage because of this affair, but deep down, I knew I couldn't build a real relationship with Ryan. What we had wasn't stable. It lacked the depth that true relationships need to last. My time with him had been like a spark, bright but fleeting. I realized that if I truly wanted to start a new life, I had to end things with Ryan, too. I couldn't keep living in the past, trapped by my mistakes and regrets. I needed to free myself to move forward, without looking back at those who had been part of my story. As important as Ryan had been to me in that moment, he was part of my history, not my future. I decided to transfer to a different department. It wasn't easy, but I knew it was the only way to distance myself from Ryan and close that chapter. The day I was going to talk to him, I felt a mix of emotions: fear, guilt, and a strange sense of relief. I knew this conversation would mark the final end of our relationship, and I understood it would be hard for both of us. We met at a cafe near the office, a place where we used to discuss work, but this time the conversation was entirely different. When I walked in, Ryan was already waiting, his expression focused and slightly apprehensive. He seemed to sense that I had something important to say. "I thought you were just taking a little break," he said with a slight smile as I sat down across from him. "Ryan," I began, feeling my throat tighten. "I wanted to talk about us, about what's been happening between us." His smile faded. He looked at me intently as if trying to figure out what I was about to say. "I can't keep doing this. I think we both know that what we have is something temporary. It's been exciting, it's been passionate, but it's not something we can build a future on." Ryan sighed and leaned back in his chair, as if he had been expecting these words. He was silent for a few seconds before he spoke. I knew this conversation would happen one day. You're right, it was something special. But you're leaving? Yes, I said quietly. I'm transferring to another department. I don't want our relationship to affect work or how I move forward with my life. He fell silent again, and I could see that he was processing what I had said. His eyes were filled with sadness, but there was no anger. He understood that I was right, and perhaps he had known for some time that this was coming. I can't blame you, he said finally. I wasn't sure we had a future either, but I don't regret any of it. His words gave me a sense of relief. We exchanged our final thoughts, and I left the cafe feeling lighter. Everything connected to Ryan was now behind me. It had been a difficult choice, but a necessary one to truly start over. I couldn't live in the past any longer. Now a new life was ahead of me, and I was ready to face it without fear. The new life didn't begin immediately. At first, there was an overwhelming sense of emptiness, as if everything that had happened over the past few months had burned a deep wound into me. When I left Oliver and ended things with Ryan, I thought I would feel instant relief, that I could finally breathe freely. But it turned out that letting go of the past wasn't as simple as I'd imagined. It lingered over me, making me reflect on what went wrong and how I had ended up in such a place. But as time passed, changes began to come. I made the decision to move to another city, a place with no memories, where I could start fresh without the ghosts of my past following me at every turn. It wasn't a spontaneous choice, it was well thought out. I knew I needed to leave behind everything that had been my life and rebuild myself. The new city became a kind of salvation. Everything was new here. The streets, the people, the job. I found work in a company with a more flexible schedule, no longer in a rigid office environment. This gave me a sense of freedom that I'd always lacked. I could finally do the things that brought me joy, read books I'd long set aside, spend more time in nature, and simply be alone with myself. At first, solitude was difficult. After so many years in marriage and then in a whirlwind relationship with Ryan, being alone felt almost unbearable. I didn't know how to be by myself, how to embrace solitude not as a punishment, but as an opportunity. But with each passing day, I began to realize that this was exactly what I needed: time to heal. I understood that I had lived my life relying on relationships, trying to find my place in the world through others. Now I was learning to find my place within myself. It wasn't easy. The process of self-discovery and acceptance took time. I went through periods of doubt, moments of longing for my old life, but I knew there was no going back. I began to find joy in the small things, like evening tea on my balcony overlooking the city or morning walks in the park. I found balance between work and personal life, and for the first time in a long time I felt like I was regaining control over my life. My relationships with Oliver and Ryan had left their mark, but that mark became not a wound, but a lesson. I realized that my mistakes didn't define me, and that I had the chance to build my future anew, without being chained to the past. I started learning to be independent of others' opinions and expectations. It was a journey toward myself, one that I probably should have taken long ago, but I only now understood its importance. Now, I knew that one day I would be ready for new relationships, not like before. I wasn't looking for passion for the sake of passion or stability for the sake of comfort. I understood that mature relationships begin when you learn to love and respect yourself. I knew I wouldn't try to fill the inner void with someone else. My solitude had become my ally, and I had learned to appreciate it. The new chapter of my life began when I accepted myself for who I truly was. Now I knew that when the time came, I could build something real. But for now, I was content with what I had: myself, my newly found peace, and the freedom I had long been searching for.